The moment, everything changed. The phone rang at exactly 2:13 a.m. William's eyes flew open, his heart pounding against his ribs. The darkness around him felt heavier than usual, pressing down on his chest like an invisible weight. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow. The phone kept ringing, sharp, insistent, slicing through the silence of the night. His hand trembled as he reached for it. Calls at this hour never brought good news. A lump formed in his throat as he pressed the receiver to his ear. "Mr. Harrison, we're sorry. Your brother passed away in his sleep." Time stopped. The room blurred. His breath stalled. The voice on the other end kept speaking. Something about arrangements, paperwork, condolences. But the words barely registered. Michael, his brother, his last living family. Gone. Just like that. A coldness spread through his chest. He gripped the phone tighter, as if holding on to it could somehow hold on to Michael. But there was nothing left to hold. The funeral was a haze of blurred faces and whispered condolences. The sound of dirt hitting the coffin was dull, almost distant. William stood there, nodding, murmuring thank yous, but inside, he felt hollow. And then the loneliness set in. Not the kind that comes from an empty house or from silence stretching too long. No, this was something deeper. It was a loneliness that crept into his bones, whispering a truth he had spent years trying to ignore. Everyone was leaving. His wife, Margaret, gone. His best friend from college, gone. Now, his brother, gone. How many more losses could one heart endure before it simply stopped beating? He walked through his house that evening, touching things that no longer seemed to belong to him. Margaret's favorite chair, now gathering dust. The old clock on the mantel still ticking, though time itself felt meaningless. The family photos on the wall, faces frozen in moments that no longer existed. The world outside kept moving. People still laughed. They went to work, fell in love, made plans for the future. But William? William felt like a ghost, invisible, forgotten, waiting. And the question that haunted him the most, the one that kept him awake long after the lights went out, wasn't, "When will I die?" but rather, "What happens when the world forgets I was ever here?" He tried to shake the thought, but it followed him everywhere when he looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. When he woke up and realized no one was waiting for him at the breakfast table. When he sat alone in the park, watching life move on without him. For years, William had been a professor of philosophy. He had spent his life studying time, impermanence, the nature of existence. He had taught students to seek wisdom, to find meaning. But now, standing at the edge of his own mortality, none of those lessons brought him comfort. For the first time in his life, he was lost. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in the park, he saw her, an old woman sitting quietly on a nearby bench. She was like him, grey-haired, wrinkled, moving slowly, but something about her was different. She wasn't lost in sorrow. She wasn't afraid. She sat there, hands resting gently on her lap, her eyes half closed as if she were drinking in the moment. William couldn't look away. What was it that she had found? How had she made peace with this stage of life, while he was drowning in fear? And in that moment, he realized something. Maybe the answers he was searching for weren't in books. Maybe they had been waiting for him in the quiet spaces of life, in the lessons that only time could teach. It was time to stop running. It was time to face what was coming. Not with fear, but with understanding. But how? How does one find peace? In the face of inevitable loss, how do we embrace aging without bitterness? How do we live fully even as time takes everything away? William didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. He had one last journey to take. A journey not to fight time, but to make peace with it. A journey not to escape loss, but to find meaning in it. A journey to uncover the kind of peace that no illness, no grief, and no passage of time could take away. And what he found would change everything. If you have ever felt the weight of aging, the sting of loss, or the quiet fear of what lies ahead, this story is for you. Let's take this journey together. Let's uncover the path to true peace, the kind that no sickness, No grief and no passage of time can steal from us. Join a Buddhist life philosophy and walk this path with us. Because peace isn't found in avoiding life's hardships, it's found in learning how to meet them with an open heart. Accepting impermanence. A lesson from falling leaves. The wind carried a crisp chill as William sat by his window, watching the golden leaves drift toward the ground. They spiraled gently, weightless, surrendering to the pull of the earth without resistance. He followed one in particular, a bright amber leaf that had once been vibrant and full of life, now dry and brittle, yet beautiful in its descent. It twirled in the air before settling among hundreds of others that had already made their journey. A soft sigh escaped his lips. Everything changes. Once, he had been like the sturdy branches outside his window, strong, unwavering, full of purpose. His body had obeyed him without hesitation. His days had been filled with work, love and companionship. But now, his hands trembled when he held a cup of tea. His mind sometimes struggled to grasp the thoughts that once came effortlessly, and the people he had loved were disappearing one by one, like leaves carried away by the wind. For so long he had resisted this truth. He had clung to the past, to the life he once knew, unwilling to accept the inevitable. But the leaves did not resist. They let go. They did not cling to the branches, nor did they mourn their fall. They simply surrendered, knowing that their time had come, and that their descent was not an end, but a transformation. He had spent decades teaching his students about impermanence, the nature of all things to change, to arise and pass away. He had spoken about the Buddhist concept of anicca, the truth that nothing in this world remains the same. But now, sitting alone, he realized that knowing something and accepting it were entirely different things. A gust of wind sent another, flurry of leaves cascading down. William leaned forward, watching as they blanketed the earth. Where do they go after they fall? He wondered. He thought back to his wife, Margaret, to Michael, to the friends he had lost over the years. Had they too simply fallen, vanishing into nothingness, or had they, like the leaves, become part of something greater? A memory surfaced. Margaret, standing in this very spot years ago, laughing as she reached for a leaf caught in her hair. "Look at this, Will," she had said. "So delicate, yet so fearless. It doesn't fight the wind. It just goes where it's meant to." William swallowed hard. He had fought the wind all his life, resisting change, grieving what was lost, fearing what lay ahead. But the leaves had a wisdom he had yet to learn. Maybe life wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about learning to let go. The thought settled deep in his heart. He had spent too much time mourning what was gone, fearing what was coming, and not enough time being here now, in this moment, where life was still happening. Outside, a young girl in a bright red coat ran through the fallen leaves, her laughter ringing through the crisp air. She kicked up golden piles with each step, delighting in their rustling beneath her feet. To her, the leaves were not symbols of decay. They were something to be played with, celebrated. William let out a quiet chuckle. Perhaps he had been looking at things all wrong. The trees did not mourn their lost leaves, nor did they fear the coming winter. They simply stood tall, waiting for spring, knowing that new life would come again. He reached for the window latch and pushed it open, letting the cold air rush in. The wind tousled his thinning hair, sent a few stray leaves drifting onto his windowsill. He picked one up, running his fingers over its fragile surface. For the first time in a long while, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet surrender, a loosening of the grip he had held so tightly on time, on the past, on his fear of what lay ahead. Maybe the secret to peace wasn't in holding on, but in allowing himself to fall gently, like the leaves, to trust that even in the letting go he was still part of something greater. Practicing mindfulness, living fully in each moment one afternoon, as the autumn sun cast golden light through the trees, William found himself sitting in a quiet cafe, stirring a spoon absent-mindedly through his tea. He had spent the morning lost in thought, drifting between memories of the past and worries about the future, as he often did these days. The weight of it all sat heavy on his chest. Then a familiar voice pulled him back to the present. "William?" He looked up to see an old friend standing before him, a face he hadn't seen in years. Brother Thomas, once a philosophy student like himself, now a Buddhist monk. His robes were simple, his expression calm, his presence carrying a quiet stillness that contrasted sharply with the restless energy swirling in William's mind. They embraced briefly, then sat together, catching up on the lost years. As they talked, William found himself sharing his struggles, the loneliness, the fear, the endless cycle of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. He confessed how his mind constantly pulled him between regret for what was gone and anxiety for what lay ahead. Brother Thomas listened patiently, then smiled gently. "William," he said, "you are living everywhere except for right here, right now." William frowned. "What do you mean?" The monk lifted his tea, inhaling its aroma before taking a slow, deliberate sip. "You see this tea? I taste it. Fully because I am here with it. But if my mind were somewhere else, dwelling on yesterday or worrying about tomorrow, I would miss it entirely. Life is the same way." He placed the cup down and looked William in the eye. "You have spent your life studying philosophy, teaching others how to think deeply. But have you ever learned how to simply be?" The words stayed with William long. After they parted, that night he found himself lying awake, considering them. Had he ever truly been in the present moment? His mind had always been elsewhere, planning, analyzing, longing, regretting. But the now? It had always slipped through his fingers before he could grasp it. The next morning, William decided to try what Brother Thomas had suggested, mindfulness. It seemed simple enough. Just sit, breathe, and be present. But the moment he sat down, closed his eyes and focused on his breath, his mind rebelled. Thoughts crowded in. Memories of Margaret's laughter, the ache of losing Michael, the nagging worry about how many days he had left. His body felt restless, his skin prickled with irritation. "This is pointless," he muttered, yet something in him urged him to try again. The next day he sat in his garden, closing his eyes once more. He took a deep breath, then another. The wind brushed against his face, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Birds chirped in the distance. The warmth of the sun touched his skin, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, he was there. Not in the past, not in the future, just here. He didn't force the thoughts away. He simply let them come and go like clouds drifting across the sky. The more he practiced, the more he realized that peace wasn't about silencing his mind, but about learning to sit with whatever arose, without running from it, without clinging to it. One morning, as he was pouring tea, he noticed how the steam curled upward, dissolving into the air. He watched it, fully present, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. He remembered something Brother Thomas had said. "A glass of water, when shaken, becomes cloudy. But if you let it sit, the sediment settles and the water clears. The mind is the same way." His mind, which had been so shaken by grief and fear, was finally beginning to settle. The world had not changed. He was still an old man. Loss was still real. Time was still passing, but something within him was different, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Finding strength in the teachings of the Buddha, the path to peace. The days grew colder, and the weight of time pressed against William's shoulders like an unseen force. He had spent much of his life searching for answers, in philosophy, in literature, in the voices of great thinkers. But nothing had prepared him for this stage of life, where each morning felt uncertain, where the past tugged at him and the future loomed like an unanswered question. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, his eyes fell upon an old book resting on the shelf, a collection of Buddhist scriptures he had once skimmed through in his younger years, but never truly explored. Something compelled him to pick it up. As he turned the delicate pages, he came across the Four Noble Truths, words that felt as though they had been written just for him in this very moment of his life. Life contains suffering. The cause of suffering is attachment. There is a way to end suffering. That way is through the Eightfold Path. He paused, reading the first truth over and over. Life contains suffering. It was so simple yet profound. He had spent the past few years fighting against this truth, resisting the losses that had come, fearing the changes within himself. But what if suffering wasn't something to run from? What if it was simply a part of existence, as natural as the seasons shifting from summer to fall? He read further, absorbing the eightfold path, the steps toward liberation from suffering. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The words did not offer false hope. They did not promise a life free from pain. Instead, they offered something deeper, a way to walk through suffering without being consumed by it. Not long after, William found himself in a hospital waiting room, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. He had come in for a routine checkup, yet as he sat there watching nurses move efficiently from one patient to another, he felt a familiar unease creeping in. His mind began its usual cycle. What if it's something serious? What if this is the beginning of the end? But then he remembered the teachings. Suffering comes not from pain itself, but from our resistance to it. He took a slow breath and let his body relax. Whatever would come, he would face it. If illness was part of this journey, he would not fight it with fear, but welcome it as a teacher. Just as autumn leaves surrendered to the wind, just as the ocean waves rose and fell without resistance, he too could learn to accept what was beyond his control. A nurse called his name. He rose from his chair, steady and calm, stepping forward not with dread but with quiet acceptance. That night, back at home, he lit a candle by his bedside. As the flame flickered, he thought of the Buddha's teachings once more. The candle did not resist being burned, nor did it mourn its own wax melting away. Instead, it gave light, bringing warmth to the darkness around it. William sat in the glow of the flame, feeling something shift within him. He had spent so much time mourning what was lost, fearing what lay ahead. But tonight he understood. His body may weaken, time may take all things, but how he met each moment was his to decide. Perhaps he too could be like the candle, burning not in fear, but in the quiet knowledge that even in impermanence there was light. Staying connected, finding peace through sharing. The days had grown quieter since Margaret passed, since Michael was gone, since the phone calls from old friends had slowly faded into the past. William had always thought of himself as someone who enjoyed solitude, but lately solitude had begun to feel like loneliness. The house, once filled with warmth, now echoed with emptiness. One afternoon, while taking a walk through town, he saw a small sign posted near the entrance of a local community center. Mindfulness and meditation group, all are welcome. He hesitated, staring at the paper for a long moment. He had always imagined meditation as something done in solitude, in quiet contemplation. But something about the words, all are welcome, stayed with him. That evening, he found himself standing at the doorway of the meditation hall, uncertain, wondering if he belonged here. Inside, a dozen or so people sat in a circle, their faces serene yet open. Some were young, others closer to his age. A woman in her 70s greeted him warmly, offering him a cushion. As the session began, the leader, a man in his 60s, with kind eyes, spoke gently about the power of presence, of truly seeing one another. We often think suffering isolates us, he said, but in truth it connects us, because pain is something we all share in one way or another, and when we share it, it becomes lighter. William listened, his hands resting on his lap. The group sat in silence for a while, breathing together, existing together. For the first time in years he felt something shift, a sense of belonging, as though the loneliness that had wrapped around him for so long was beginning to loosen. Then people began to speak, sharing stories of their own struggles, grief, illness, loss. When it was William's turn, he hesitated, unsure of what to say. But when he finally spoke, about Margaret, about Michael, about the long, heavy silence of his days, he saw understanding in their eyes. No one tried to offer hollow words of comfort or tell him to move on. They simply listened. And that, he realized, was enough. After that night, he returned again and again. Over time, he found himself not only listening, but also helping. He spoke to others who had just lost loved ones, offering the same quiet presence that had once been given to him. He helped an elderly man who had just been diagnosed with an illness navigate his fears. He taught a young woman, struggling with anxiety, how to sit with her breath and find stillness. He wasn't just receiving anymore. He was giving. And in giving, he found something he hadn't felt in years, a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, after the session had ended, William stayed behind to help put away the cushions. As he moved through the dimly lit room, he noticed the way the small candles flickered along the walls. Alone, a single candle gives off only a modest glow, but together many candles can fill a room with light. And he realized, people are the same. No one's suffering is truly unique. No one's grief exists in isolation. But when we come together, when we share our burdens, the weight becomes easier to carry. The darkness recedes. For so long William had believed that his pain set him apart, that growing old meant growing invisible. But now he understood. The more he opened himself to others, the less alone he felt. He no longer feared the silence of his home, because now he knew where to go, where to be seen, where to be heard, and in helping others navigate their own suffering, he found something he never expected, his own peace, turning pain into opportunity, learning to let go and forgive. William sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The lamp cast a warm glow across the wooden surface, illuminating the wrinkles in his hands, the quiet tremor in his fingers. As he held his pen, the room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, trying to find the right words, yet none came. How did one begin to write a letter that was decades overdue? Lately his mind had been drifting to the past more often, not just to the beautiful moments, the laughter, the love, the warmth of memories, but also to the things left unsaid, the wounds left unhealed. He thought of his brother, Michael. They had been close once, but there had been a fight years ago. Something small at first, but pride had turned it into something larger. Words had been exchanged, harsh words, words that should have never been spoken. And though time had softened their anger, neither of them had ever found the courage to apologize. And then Michael was gone. Just like that. No second chances. Regret had a way of creeping in when the world grew quiet, but it wasn't just Michael. There were others. Friends he had fallen out of touch with over petty disagreements, a student he had once scolded too harshly, a woman he had loved before Margaret, whom he had never truly forgiven for leaving, and most of all, himself. For years, William had carried his regrets like a heavy stone tied to his chest. He had convinced himself that some wounds could never be healed, that some mistakes could never be undone. But now, as he sat here, pen in hand, he wondered, what if he had been wrong? He took a deep breath and placed the pen to paper. Dear Michael. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and unsure. But as the ink flowed, so did his heart. He told Michael he was sorry, that he had let his pride stand in the way of something far more important, love. He told him he missed him, that he wished they had spoken sooner, before time had taken that chance away. And then something unexpected happened. As he wrote, he felt a weight lift from his chest. The regret that had sat so heavily inside him for years seemed to loosen like a rope slowly unraveling. He realized something that night. Forgiveness was not just for the other person, it was for himself. It was a gift he had deprived himself of for too long. In the weeks that followed, he wrote more letters. Some he sent, others he burned, watching the smoke carry his unspoken words into the air, releasing them like birds freed from a cage. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he watched a bird struggle against the wind. It flapped its wings with all its might, yet it barely moved. Then suddenly it let go, stopped fighting, and allowed the wind to carry it. And in that moment it soared. William smiled to himself. A bird cannot fly if it clings to the weight of a stone, and a heart cannot be free if it clings to the weight of the past. That night, for the first time in years, William slept soundly. The past had not changed. The mistakes had still been made. But now they no longer chained him. He had set them free, and in doing so, he had set himself free as well. The journey to peace a year had passed. The seasons had come and gone. The world had continued its endless cycle of change, and so had William. He was still the same man in many ways, his hair still silver, his steps still slower than they used to be. But something within him had shifted. The fear that once gripped him so tightly had loosened its hold. The longing for what was lost no longer weighed him down. He had spent the last year learning to live in a way he never had before, not by clinging to the past or worrying about the future, but by being fully present in each moment. He had learned to sit with his breath, to let his thoughts come and go like clouds in the sky. He had found solace in the teachings of the Buddha, discovering that suffering was not something to escape, but something to understand. He had let go of old regrets, freed himself from burdens he had carried for too long, and in sharing his journey with others, he had found connection, purpose, and the quiet joy of simply being. And now he stood at the edge of the ocean, feeling the cool sand beneath his feet, the salty breeze against his skin. The waves crashed before him, rushing forward, then retreating only to return again. He had always loved the sea. It had a rhythm, a certainty, a patience that he admired. No matter how fierce the storm, no matter how strong the winds, the ocean remained. It did not resist change. It embraced it. He watched as a wave rolled in, tumbling over itself before dissolving into the shore. For so long he had feared endings. He had fought against the inevitable, thinking that loss meant disappearance. That change meant losing himself. But now he understood. Nothing was ever truly lost. Nothing truly ended. It only transformed. The people he loved, the moments he cherished, they lived on, not in permanence, but in the way they had shaped him, in the love he carried forward, in the wisdom they had left behind. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the air fill his lungs. He felt the weight of his years, but not as a burden, rather as a testament to a life fully lived. He was not afraid anymore, not of aging, not of loss, not even of the unknown that lay ahead, because peace was never something to be found out. There. It was not in a distant future or in a past long gone. It was here. In this moment it was a state of being. He opened his eyes, looking out at the vast horizon, and whispered to himself, "Everything will pass, but the soul can remain as still as the ocean." A smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He turned away from the waves and began walking back toward the world, toward the life that was still waiting for him. If there was one thing he had learned, it was this: we cannot stop time. We cannot hold on to what was, but we can choose how we live, how we love, and how we let go. And in that choice there is freedom. For anyone who has ever feared aging, for anyone who has ever struggled to find meaning in loss, for anyone searching for peace, this journey is not just William's. It is all of ours. May we all learn to live fully, to let go when it is time, to meet each moment with an open heart. And if this story has resonated with you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. Because just like the waves, wisdom flows best when it is passed on. Join a Buddhist life philosophy in exploring the path to inner peace. Because true serenity isn't found in avoiding life's hardships, but in learning to embrace them.